Let's start off by crediting South Florida. They played with the appropriate level of force and
Everyone thought the national team roster was a closed chapter, a finalized list of veterans destined to bring home the gold without any distractions. But whispers leaking out of a highly restricted closed-door practice session have just turned the entire basketball world upside down and left some of the sport's most powerful coaches completely speechless. Rumors have been swirling for weeks about what really happens when the cameras stop rolling and the rising stars face off against the established veterans in environments where pride is the only thing on the line. People assumed the older players would easily assert their dominance and prove exactly why the selection committee made the choices they did, justifying the exclusion of the most famous rookie in the history of the sport. Instead, eyewitnesses from a recent high-level scrimmage say Caitlin Clark stepped onto the hardwood and executed moves so flawless and unprecedented that the entire gym fell dead silent. She wasn't just playing basketball. She was putting on a masterclass that completely dismantled the defensive strategies of the best players in the world. It was a moment of pure, undeniable talent that instantly validated every single fan who argued she was robbed of a spot on the global stage. The sheer intensity of the scrimmage reportedly caught the veteran players completely off guard as they expected a timid newcomer who would naturally defer to their seniority. But the rookie arrived with a visible chip on her shoulder, fully prepared to exploit every single weakness in the national team's defensive armor. What happened over the course of that session was nothing short of a basketball revelation, exposing the glaring flaws in an old-school mentality that prioritizes tenure over transcendent ability. But the unbelievable shots she took that day were only the very beginning of a much larger, far more controversial story. What unfolded next on that practice floor completely defied the laws of physics and exposed the glaring gaps in the veteran squad's defensive schemes. Clark began pulling up from well beyond the logo, sinking consecutive shots with a release so fast that the seasoned defenders couldn't even get their hands up in time to contest the ball. We are talking about deep, incredibly difficult threes that are normally considered terrible shots for anyone else. But for her, they were dropping with terrifying consistency. The coaches standing on the sideline, the very same people who forcefully argued that she needed more time to develop before facing international competition, were allegedly exchanging nervous glances as the net kept swishing without the ball ever touching the rim. She was drawing double and even triple coverage the second she crossed half-court, creating a chaotic, unmanageable gravitational pull that the established national team simply did not know how to handle. Every time they tried to aggressively trap her in the corners or blitz her on the pick and roll, she found an impossible escape route, completely neutralizing the physical play that veterans usually rely on to intimidate younger players. The sheer offensive pressure she applied was unlike anything the coaching staff had prepared for, highlighting exactly what the official roster was desperately missing when it came to stretching the floor. Defenders who have won multiple championships and defensive awards were reportedly left looking entirely helpless, their footwork rendered obsolete by a player who seemingly possessed unlimited shooting range. This wasn't just a lucky streak. It was a systematic dismantling of a defensive philosophy that had governed the national team for over a decade. And what happened next would shock everyone in the building even more. It wasn't just her shooting that left the building entirely stunned. It was a display of court vision so hyper-advanced that it made Olympic-level defenders look like they were moving in slow motion. Clark started threading blind. No-look passes through impossibly tight windows, anticipating the movements of players before they even knew where they were supposed to be going themselves. In one specific rumored sequence that has been heavily discussed in inner basketball circles, she whipped a blistering pass right through the extended arms of three converging defenders, hitting a cutter perfectly in stride for an uncontested layup. The national team veterans were visibly frustrated, completely unable to read her eyes or predict her next move because she was processing the geometry of the game at a speed they simply hadn't encountered before. Coaches who had built their entire legendary careers on preaching fundamental conservative basketball were suddenly watching a first-year pro effortlessly rewrite the playbook right in front of their eyes. Her ability to mentally manipulate the defense, forcing them to overcommit to the threat of her shooting, only to punish them with a devastating assist, was an absolute nightmare for the opposing sideline to strategize against. It became glaringly obvious to every single person in that gym that her basketball IQ was not just ready for the global stage, but it was arguably superior to the seasoned veterans who were supposed to be the undisputed gold standard. She was essentially playing chess while the greatest defensive stoppers in the country were playing checkers, reacting a full second too late to every single decision she made. But that astonishing display of offensive mastery wasn't the whole story. To truly understand the massive weight of what happened in that gym, you have to look back at the wildly controversial highly criticized decision that sparked this entire firestorm in the first place. When the official Olympic roster was announced to the public, and Clark's name was glaringly absent from the list, the selection committee aggressively hid behind the excuse of veteran experience and the vital need for established chemistry. They claimed the international game was far too physical, demanding, and nuanced for a rookie to handle, completely ignoring the undeniable fact that she had just spent her entire collegiate career breaking every scoring record imaginable under immense, suffocating pressure. The mainstream media narrative immediately tried to spin the exclusion as a necessary rite of passage, suggesting that rookies simply need to wait their turn regardless of their actual quantifiable talent or impact on the sport. But the public wasn't buying a single word of it. And the sheer volume of global outrage proved that the fans instantly recognized a deeply political decision when they saw one. It felt significantly less about assembling the absolute best basketball talent in the country, and far more about protecting the fragile egos of older players who felt deeply threatened by the sudden arrival of a generational superstar. The committee gambled heavily on the desperate hope that their veteran squad would dominate so thoroughly in Paris that people would eventually forget about the monumental snub. They assumed the noise would die down once the medals were handed out, completely underestimating the massive cultural phenomenon they had just intentionally sidelined. But the reality of that secret practice session proved their massive gamble was a colossal, embarrassing failure from the very start. The undeniable truth of her overwhelming skill level has actually started to severely crack the unified front of the coaching establishment, leading to some truly unexpected headline-making public admissions. Dawn Staley, a highly respected, deeply influential voice and key figure in the national team ecosystem, recently shocked the entire sports world by publicly admitting that if the committee had to make the decision all over again, Clark would be right at the top of their list. This was a massive, unprecedented pivot from the original, carefully crafted narrative, essentially serving as a thinly veiled, highly public confession that the committee knew they had made a terrible, perhaps unforgivable mistake. Staley's incredibly candid comments validated exactly what the passionate fans had been screaming at the top of their lungs for months. That you simply do not leave a player with that kind of transformative offensive gravity off a roster designed to showcase the absolute best talent in the world. This admission was a massive fatal blow to the original flimsy justification of needing more experience, proving once and for all that raw game-changing talent will always outweigh tenure when the lights are at their absolute brightest. It also strongly hinted at the intense behind-the-scenes regret that has been aggressively eating away at the establishment as they are forced to watch her completely dominate the professional league night after night. Staley's words broke the unspoken code of silence among the coaching elite, giving credibility to the rumors that the selection room was deeply divided from the very beginning. And what the other more stubborn coaches did in response to this shifting tide would only add explosive fuel to the fire. While some highly respected figures like Staley were willing to swallow their pride and acknowledge the undeniable reality of the situation, others aggressively doubled down on their defensive posture, creating a toxic, heavily scrutinized atmosphere of stubbornness. Coach Cheryl Reeve, who has historically been fiercely protective of her veteran players and incredibly dismissive of outside noise, suddenly found herself squarely in the crosshairs of intense, unforgiving public scrutiny as Clark continued to shatter expectations. Reeve's highly defensive social media activity and incredibly frustrated media responses painted a crystal-clear picture of an old-school establishment desperately clinging to a crumbling hierarchy that was rapidly fading into irrelevance. There were widespread, persistent whispers of intense, cutthroat locker room politics where older established players allegedly banded together in a coordinated effort to ensure the new, wildly popular face of the league was kept entirely in her place. This underlying palpable tension completely transformed every single regular season game and private practice into a deeply personal, fiercely contested battle with veterans playing hyper-aggressive, incredibly physical defense to prove a point, only to get completely torched by Clark's limitless deep range. The organized resistance from the old guard wasn't just about the game of basketball anymore. It was a desperate, transparent battle for relevance in a rapidly shifting landscape that was entirely moving toward a brand new era without their permission. They were fighting against an inevitable wave of change, utilizing every dark art and physical tactic available to try and slow down a player who simply refused to be intimidated. But their collective refusal to adapt and embrace the future was about to cost them dearly on the national stage. Using the massive, deeply personal disrespect of the Olympic roster snub as absolute high-octane fuel, Clark embarked on what can only be described as the most lethal, unrelenting revenge tour the professional league has ever witnessed. She didn't just quietly accept the committee's highly flawed decision. She stepped onto the professional court and systematically began obliterating legendary records that had stood untouched for years. She utterly shattered the all-time single-aim assist record, dishing out mind-boggling numbers that seasoned Hall of Fame point guards couldn't even dream of achieving while simultaneously carrying the massive offensive load for her struggling franchise. Every single time she casually logged an effortless triple-double or effortlessly dropped 30 points against elite defenses, it served as a glaring, inescapable, deeply humiliating reminder to the national team of exactly what they chose to leave sitting at home. She played with a visible, terrifying chip on her shoulder, elevating her less experienced teammates and forcefully dictating the flow of the game, forcing the entire league to play at her relentless, completely exhausting pace. The tired, overused experience argument completely evaporated into thin air as she consistently outplayed, outsmarted, and outshot the very same established veterans who were controversially selected over her for the global stage. It was no longer just a passionate debate about her future potential. It was hard, undeniable mathematical, statistical proof that she was already the best, most impactful point guard in the entire country, bar none. But the profound, far-reaching impact of her incredible dominance reached far beyond the traditional box score. The massive financial and deep cultural fallout of leaving a true generational icon off the international roster quickly morphed into the biggest unspoken disaster for the governing body in recent memory. While Clark was busy single-handedly selling out massive professional arenas across the entire country and driving national television ratings into an unprecedented stratosphere, the national team was facing an incredibly uncomfortable, sobering reality regarding their own stagnant viewership. The massive, undeniable drop in overall interest and engagement whenever she wasn't stepping onto the floor exposed a harsh, unignorable truth. The casual fans weren't just tuning in to watch women's basketball in general. They were tuning in specifically to watch the magic of Caitlin Clark by foolishly prioritizing internal locker room politics and fragile veteran egos over the most electrifying, globally recognized player in a decade. The organization completely missed out on a historic once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to aggressively grow the game on an international scale. Massive corporate sponsors, major television networks, and millions of fans were all left completely baffled by a deeply flawed system that actively chose to hide its absolute brightest star rather than proudly showcase her to the entire world. The noticeable empty seats at some highly publicized events stood in stark, deeply embarrassing contrast to the absolute frenzy and sold-out crowds that followed Clark's every single move in the professional league. The boardroom executives were reportedly furious, realizing that the petty internal squabbles of a few coaches had cost the sport millions of dollars in potential revenue and unmatched global exposure. And the deeply entrenched establishment was quickly realizing that they absolutely could not afford to make the same monumental, financially devastating mistake twice. The severe physical toll of this deeply political, highly publicized battle has also shed a blinding light on a much darker, highly controversial side of the professional league's overall culture. From the exact moment she boldly stepped onto the professional hardwood, Clark was subjected to a shocking level of physical targeting, aggressive hazing, and borderline dangerous fouls that was entirely unsportsmanlike. Cheap shots away from the ball, completely blindside screens designed to cause harm, and overly hostile defensive tactics became a sad nightly occurrence, seemingly ignored or even quietly encouraged by jealous veterans who felt deeply threatened by her meteoric, unprecedented rise to superstardom. But rather than breaking her spirit, complaining to the referees, or forcing her to back down from the challenge, this incredibly hostile environment only sharpened her unbelievable resilience and absolute mental toughness. She took the absolute worst punishment the bitter old guard had to violently throw at her, calmly brushed it off, and immediately responded by sinking heavily contested daggers right in their faces from 30 feet away. This incredible, awe-inspiring display of stoic composure under intense, deeply unfair pressure completely destroyed the false manufactured narrative that she wasn't physically or mentally ready for the brutal nature of the international stage. Every single flagrant foul she silently endured only made the coaching staff's previous excuses look even more hollow, petty, and entirely ridiculous in the eyes of the viewing public. She was surviving a nightly gauntlet of physical abuse that would have broken seasoned veterans, proving that her mental fortitude was just as elite as her flawless jump shot. But the absolute, ultimate vindication for all of this suffering was still rapidly approaching on the horizon. The sheer hypocrisy of the situation became a massive talking point on every major sports network, podcast, and social media platform, creating a relentless media storm that the national team simply could not escape. Analysts who had covered the sport for decades openly questioned the integrity of the selection process, pointing out that in any other professional sport, the most commercially viable and statistically dominant player is automatically given the keys to the franchise, not relegated to the sidelines. The intense public pressure forced the governing body to release multiple highly defensive statements trying to justify their deeply flawed metrics. but the damage to their credibility had already been permanently done. Fans started actively comparing Clark's controversial snub to some of the greatest historical injustices in sports history, drawing direct parallels to legendary players who were left off iconic rosters due to petty personal grievances rather than actual basketball merit. The intense scrutiny placed a massive, suffocating magnifying glass on every single mistake the national team made during their preparation, turning what should have been a celebratory victory tour into an incredibly tense, highly defensive campaign. Every missed three-pointer, every sloppy turnover, and every uninspired offensive possession by the veteran squad was instantly clipped, widely shared, and ruthlessly compared to Clark's flawless highlight reel from the night before. The incredible irony was that by desperately trying to avoid the supposed distraction of a highly publicized rookie, the committee had actually created the biggest, most disruptive media circus the program had ever seen. And what emerged from the ashes?